Middle of page 12. For God's sake, how did this happen? First her father, now her stepmother, Lizzie reeled at the second blow, appearing so very much overcome that Alice Russell was compelled to shepherd her friend out of the hot kitchen and into the dining room. There Lizzie threw herself down on the green-striped lounge at the end of the room. Alice bustled and fussed over Lizzie, anxious to keep her cool and calm. Thinking she was faint, she started to loosen Lizzie's dress, but Lizzie suddenly rallied, refusing to succumb completely to Alice's ministrations. "I am not faint," Lizzie declared. Nevertheless, Alice and Miss Churchill strove to maintain an atmosphere of calm for Lizzie's sake, even as rapid succession of policemen bombarded the Borden property. Rocky Point. Not every member of the Fall River Police Force was at the Borden house on August 4th. Far from it. It just so happened that the homicide at 92 2nd Street coincided with an annual policeman's excursion to a popular amusement park. At 8 that morning, a number of officers and their families had boarded the steamer Mount Hope, bound for Rocky Point in Warwick, Rhode Island. There, on the shores of Nagasat Bay, they could partake of theater, vaudeville shows, music, dancing, a Ferris wheel, a toboggan run, and various outdoor sports. The ferry would not return for them until 4:15 that afternoon. Just now, many policemen were absent that day. Accounts vary. The Boston Advertiser estimated only half the force was away, while in the Fall River Globe's report the figure swelled to 80%. The more conservative Fall River Daily Herald settled on a non-specific majority. Author Edward Radden, who busted many a Borden myth in the 1960s, was most conservative of all, saying the picnic was limited to off-duty patrolmen. Whatever the actual number, the on-duty policemen were at a distinct disadvantage. First came Inspector Patrick Dowtry and Deputy Sheriff Francis Wixon. Then Officer Allen returned to the scene with officers Michael Millay and John Devine. They swarmed everywhere, searching the barn, the yard, the cellar, and attics. Virtually all of them angled for a glimpse of Mr. and Miss Borden, and all of them wanted information from Lizzie. "Did you see anyone around here? Is there any Portuguese working on the farm over the river for your father?" Portuguese. To be Portuguese in Fall River in 1892 meant to be constantly under suspicion. As far as the middle and upper class citizens were concerned, members of the swarthy-skinned Roman Catholic immigrant population were the first to blame for any unsavory goings-on, and August 4th was no different. One Portuguese man was brought into the police station on the day of the murders for withdrawing his life savings of about $60, approximately $1,450 today, from the bank. Another was reported for asking directions to New York. What motive? Was it robbery? Have you any reason, no matter how slight, to suspect anybody? Even Lizzie's own relatives could not spare her their questions. Shortly after Millay and Dowtry finished probing her for information, Lizzie's uncle John Morse burst in, demanding, "For God's sakes, how did this happen?" Nothing had seemed amiss when he dropped in for an overnight visit the afternoon before. Just 3 hours earlier, Andrew Borden himself had unhooked the back screen door for him, inviting Morse to finish his errands in time to share their noon meal. Now both his hosts were dead. Dr. Bowen, returning from the telegraph office just as Millay and Wilcox arrived, did his best to shield Lizzie from the mounting commotion. He covered Mr. Borden again and instructed Alice Russell to take Lizzie upstairs. She better go up to her room, the doctor said, and stay there. Alice readily agreed. Despite the admirable composure Lizzie had displayed with Millay and Dowtry, the congestion and disorder on the first floor were becoming too much to expect her to handle. Alice herself was so bewildered by it all, she did not know any more how many people were in the house. Without the policemen buzzing around her, Lizzie's thoughts returned to practical matters. "When it is necessary for an undertaker, I want windward," she told Alice upstairs, wanting to make sure Dr. Bowen knew of her wishes concerning funeral arrangements. And there was another, even more personal matter, something she must tell her doctor about. If the policemen found it, they would surely jump into the wrong conclusions. A small pail of blood-stained clothes soaking in the cellar. Incriminating as it seemed, the bloody little bucket had no bearing on the search. It was instead a spectacularly inconvenient coincidence. At the time of her parents' murder, with the whole of the Fall River police force mobilizing a hunt for a blood-splattered murderer, Miss Lizzie Borden had the misfortune to be menstruating. With Alice gone to fetch Dr. Bowen, Lizzie stepped into her sister's room. Like many of the rooms on the second floor, the sister's bedroom connected. Emma had traded bedrooms with her sister 2 years ago, and Lizzie's things were now arranged in the larger of the two. When Lizzie gained the space, however, she lost in privacy. Anyone who wanted to enter or leave Emma's room had to walk through Lizzie's to do so. Lizzie's bedroom also adjoined the guest room and her parents' bedroom. There were latches on both sides of her parents' doors, though, and the guest room door was not only locked and bolted, but locked by her tall writing desk. No one could enter her room unless she allowed it. Still, on either side of those other doors, Lizzie could hear voices, footsteps. Occasionally the handles rattled as another police officer tried to turn them. Emma's room, with its single entrance, was the most private space she had access to just then, and Lizzie Borden wasted no time in taking full advantage of it. We knew the state she was in. When Alice returned, she found Lizzie just stepping out of Emma's room, tying a red ribbon at her waist. In a few minutes she was alone. Lizzie had changed from an old blue skirt and blouse into a pink and white striped wrapper, a dress that crossed in the front like a robe and fastened with a bow. It ought not to have seemed odd. No lady who expected to greet callers would remain in her work dress. Granted, a murder investigation is not exactly a social occasion, but even Alice herself had quickly changed into a fresh dress before running to the Borden house when Bridget came for help. Bridget Sullivan would also steal a few moments to do the same before an afternoon was over. There was something about the pink wrapper of Lizzie's, though. Perhaps it was the bright red ribbon or the sheen of the pale fabric's finish, but everyone who saw Lizzie in that dress that day seemed to take particular notice of it. If Lizzie's change of clothes struck Alice as strange, at the moment she brushed off her misgivings. With so many people in the house, she reasoned Lizzie wanted to get into a respectable appearance. It wasn't just the police who wanted to see her. By 1 o'clock, 2 visitors offering support and condolences arrived at 92 2nd Street. The Reverend Edwin Beck and Miss Marianne Holmes, mother of one of Lizzie's former schoolmates. Throughout the afternoon, the two of them helped Alice tend to Lizzie as though she were an invalid. Alice was grateful for the extra hands. She had no intention of leaving Lizzie alone again, knowing the state she was in. When one was out, another made a point to be there. Lizzie stayed on her little sofa bed by the windows with Reverend Buck sitting quietly beside her and let them fuss over her. Her head ached. Dr. Bowen brought her a preparation of Roma caffeine, a medication about as potent as an aspirin, to blunt the pain and calm her nerves. They kept her bedroom door locked, too. Retreating upstairs had gained Lizzie only a little more privacy. Her door stood right at the head of the steps. Everyone who came to view Miss Borden's body, policemen, medical examiners, reporters, passed by it on their way to the spare room, and if Lizzie's door was not kept locked, they were apt to open it on their way past. The locked door did not prevent the policemen from gaining access to Lizzie, however. 2 more policemen, first Medley and then Officer Philip Harrington, came knocking and interviewed Lizzie in her bedroom. Next, Molly returned with yet more questions. After Molly came Assistant Marshal John Fleet in plain clothes. He asked more of the questions Lizzie had answered at least half a dozen times already. Where were you? How long? Who has been in the house? Could your uncle or the maid have had anything to do with it? Lizzie gave him the answer she had given to all the others. Her story, assembled from the hundreds of questions she answered over the first week, went like this. There were a few trifling chores to do that morning. Handkerchiefs that needed ironing, some clean clothes to put away, a bit of mending. The handkerchiefs lay ready and sprinkled on the little ironing board in the dining room, but her flat irons were not hot enough. As she waited for them to heat on the stove, Lizzie leafed idly through an old Harper's magazine at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Her father napped in the sitting room. She had just watched him fold his Prince Albert coat into a pillow and stretched out on the sofa. Her stepmother was upstairs making up the guest room, or perhaps by now down street, doing the 1 or 2 errands she'd mentioned to Lizzie earlier. Bridget had finished washing the windows and gone up to her attic bedroom to snatch a catnap of her own before fixing dinner. Down street. Why down street instead of downtown? Because the heart of Fall River lay in the dimple in the landscape. Rising to the north was the hill, where the mill owners and others well-to-do families had their grand homes. South was the Borden's neighborhood, an area called the Flats, which ranged across another smaller hill that also pointed downward into the business district. Here, mostly middle-class families lived alongside small groceries, restaurants, laundries, churches, stables, and candy stores. Whether they came from the hill or the Flats, most citizens of Fall River had to literally descend the street to reach the city's center. Lizzie grew bored with the magazine. Still, the stubborn Flatirons were not hot. She could not say what made her think, just at that moment, of her fishing poles. She had not used them for 5 years or so, but a party of friends had arranged a fishing excursion on Monday, and it seemed to Lizzie that there were no sinkers on her lines last time she used them. Perhaps she could find some lead or iron up in the barn for new ones. It was something to do, anyway, while the slow Flats heated. Lizzie left the kitchen and went out into the yard, leaving the side screen door unlatched behind her. The Borden pears were ripe already, riper than the Shanigans' whole orchard just over the back fence. Lizzie dallied to gather a few from the ground beneath a tree near the barn before climbing to the loft. They were still cool from the night's chill, their flesh sweet and light, not at all like the mutton soup the family had been dining on since Wednesday noon. After the way she felt that day before, she did not even want to think about meat. She nibbled at one and then another as she straightened to the curtains on the window in the west peak, the one that looked down over the house. There she lingered for no reason in particular, munching on the last of her pears in full view of the side yard and screen door before crossing the loft to rummage through a box of old things on the workbench. And then, was that a noise? The window was closed. She had heard nothing out of the ordinary before, but now a peculiar noise that seemed to Lizzie something like scraping or a groan. By the time Lizzie Borden reached the screen door, it was wide open. A thought that was most revolting. Assistant Marshal Fleet listened to Lizzie's story, noting it all down. Then he asked, "Has your father or mother—" "She is not my mother," Lizzie interrupted. "She is my stepmother. My own mother is dead." It was plain and simple fact, but under the circumstances, the remark did not sit well with Fleet. To top it off, Lizzie's demeanor struck the assistant marshal as decidedly chill. More troubling yet, not at any time during the interview had she been in tears. Fleet's impressions dovetailed all too neatly with the intuitions Officer Harrington felt during his own encounter with the freshly orphaned Miss Borden. Harrington observed that in contrast to Alice Russell, whose deathly pallor, short, sharp breathing, and fidgeting hands had betrayed her anxiety, Lizzie stood by the foot of the bed and talked in the most calm and collected manner. Her whole bearing was most remarkable under the circumstances. There was not the least indication of agitation, no sign of sorrow or grief, no lamentation of the heart, no comment on the horror of the crime, and no expression of a wish that the criminal be caught. All this, and something that, to me, is indescribable, gave birth to the thought that was most revolting. Right then and there, with no more evidence than that, Lizzie Borden became the prime suspect.